Hi, how are you? Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Carrie Coogan, Deputy Director of Community Engagement and Public Affairs for the library, and we're so thrilled to be celebrating the Kansas City Public Library's 150th anniversary. And, and we're also celebrating the launch of the Kansas City Public Library History Book. Yay. Co-authored by our own Jason Rowe. So from its humble start in 1873 with just a single bookcase, the library has grown into a vital part of our city, empowering and inspiring generations through knowledge and lifelong learning. And music. This library has not only established itself as a pillar of the community, but also in many respects as a trailblazer nationally with its early focus on children's literature and more modern day emphasis on signature programming and large-scale author events. I, along with many others here, including staff, feel so fortunate to be with the library at this important milestone. So inside the history book of the library, you'll hear about countless Kansas Citians who have come to the library for inspiration and community. People like Walt Disney, Ewing Kauffman, the great Alvin Sykes, Mayor Kay Barnes, and Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, just to name a few. All have found something meaningful within these walls. One person who played a key role in shaping the library's early years was Carrie Westlake Whitney, the library's first director and a woman starting in 1881. She worked tirelessly to expand the library and make it a cornerstone for everyone in Kansas City. Her leadership helped set the foundation for the institution that we all know and love today. It's notable as we begin our next 150 years, we have a new director, Abby Yellman, with a fitting and valuable library background as well, and also has Kansas City ties. So, exciting news, we are also offering those of you who are here tonight a free copy, a gift of the book. As a thank you for your support of our library and the staff. So now, for our program tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce our friend and colleague here at the library and co-author of the book, Jason Rowe. Jason holds, that's right, Jason holds a PhD from the University of Kansas and is the library's digital history specialist. His work has been absolutely essential in bringing the library's remarkable story to life. Jason is the co-author of Wide Open Town, Kansas City in the Pendergast Era, and the editor of the award-winning library websites, The Pendergast Years and the Civil War on the Western Border, the Missouri-Kansas Conflict. Jason has done an incredible job on this new history book, and I want to personally thank him on behalf of the library staff and the Board of Trustees for the inordinate amount of work he put into it. He has created a piece of history that will matter well into the future, ensuring that the library's rich legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. His dedication, his passion, and his expertise as a historian have truly fleshed out the library's story in a way that honors the past while bravely looking towards the future. Thank you again for being here tonight, and now I'll turn it over to Jason Rowe.
Thank you, and good evening. As the Kansas City Public Library approached its 150th anniversary, I was asked to write a book about the history of the library, specifically to capture what the library has meant to the community across so many years. How does one tell that story, or really the thousands of stories of people accessing and benefiting from the library over 150 years and fit it into a short and accessible book? I will try to keep my comments shorter than 150 years tonight. To honor the work done by tens of thousands of patrons, librarians, and supporters, it needed to do more than just list a series of buildings opening and closing, or directors coming and going. Along with my co-author, Matt Reeves, who formerly was an employee in the Missouri Valley Special Collections and has moved on, and he's out of town tonight, so he couldn't be with us. We kept coming back to the same questions and the same framework for the book. What does the Kansas City Public Library mean to the community? How did this community-based history unfold? How did modern values of librarianship manifest here in Kansas City? Values such as the American Library Association's Freedom to Read Statement and Bill of Rights. What challenges have been overcome? Across eras, one consistent theme emerged, that the library is an indispensable agent of community empowerment. A few stories from our past illustrate this theme of empowerment. I was told to double-click the first time. After his family moved to Kansas City in 1911, a young Walt Disney found respite and sparked his imagination in the stories of Mark Twain, Horatio Alger, and Tom Swift. 3 decades later, on August 17, 1937, Disney wrote a letter to the acting director of the library. It read in part, "It gives me pleasure to tell you how highly I regard the services offered by the public libraries and especially that of the Kansas City Library. All during the early years of my youth and a long time before I had given a career any thought, the public library has always held a tremendous interest for me. Needless to say, any book that offered information on drawing was likely to be found listed on my card, and overdue books were the chief reason for my usually depleted bank account." Later, in Kansas City, when I became seriously interested in cartooning, I gained my first information on animation from a book written by H.C. Lutz, which I procured from the Kansas City Public Library. I feel the public library has been a very definite help to me all through my career. Oh, I should point out that is his boyhood home in Kansas City. Community empowerment does not just refer to the entrepreneurial successes of the library's patrons. Few people represent the modern values of libraries, as longtime human rights champion Alvin Sykes, described by the New York Times as the nation's most persistent advocate for civil rights era justice. Sykes attained national acclaim despite a challenging childhood spent in foster care or boys' homes. He dropped out of school after the 8th grade, but he spent his time at the library. He later quipped, "I transferred to the public library." His life changed forever when his close friend, jazz musician, and African-American Steve Harvey was murdered in Kansas City's Penn Valley Park on November 4th, 1980. Harvey, then 27, was killed by 19-year-old Raymond Bledsoe, who mistakenly believed that Harvey was gay because of the park's reputation. At trial, Bledsoe, who was white, was acquitted by an all-white jury. This despite testimony from 2 of Bledsoe's friends who had actually aided in the assault. Sykes called the U.S. Department of Justice only to learn that nothing could be done because of the Constitution's prohibition against double jeopardy. Undeterred, though, Sykes researched legal appeals at Kansas City's main library. He discovered that the Civil Rights Act of 1968 contained language that could prompt the Justice Department to reopen the case. In 1983, Bledsoe was convicted of hate crimes, and he was sentenced to life in prison for violating Harvey's civil rights. From that point forward, and without a formal legal education, Sykes utilized the resources of the library to blaze a path as a self-described human rights worker. His work never earned him much money, but his activism resulted in progress on civil rights on a national scale. Notably, Sykes worked with U.S. Senator Jim Talent to inaugurate the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act of 2008. The measure passed the House of Representatives with a 422-2 vote. And his testimony before Congress was widely credited with moving the bill through the Senate as well. It was signed into law by President George W. Bush, and it authorized $13 million each year to reopen unsolved civil rights cases. In an obituary in the New York Times, the director of the California-based Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism was effusive. Anyone who worked in civil rights during the last several decades knew Alvin Sykes. He changed the face of American law, and he learned it all in a Kansas City library. Reflecting on his own life's work, Sykes had earlier recounted, there was a time when somebody like me wouldn't have been allowed inside a library, or as a black man permitted to read at all. But I was able to revolve much of my life around the library. I saw it and got my education here. The significance of the library to the community can be traced to its earliest origins, which took place in a wild western town still recovering from the turmoil of the Civil War and the Reconstruction eras. The library was founded as part of the Kansas City Public School District with a proclamation on December 5th, 1873. With its first bookcase, which the district purchased from Colonel William E. Sheffield, and a collection of the American Encyclopedia, the library served the students of the district and the public alike. And this bookcase is still on display in the first floor of this building, so be sure to check it out. It's by the reference desk. Almost 3 years after its founding, the library made books available for lending to the public, not just for reference on site. The school superintendent, James M. Greenwood, supervised the lending services personally from his own office. Borrowers had to pay a subscription fee and could check out one book at a time at a cost of $2 per year. And it was more money back then, and it was also an option, apparently, to purchase a life subscription, which became a moot point about 20 years later when book lending became free. Greenwood was no stranger to the difficulty of accessing books in the mid-19th century. As a teenager living in rural Missouri, Greenwood had to sell a family steer to buy a collection of classical literature, algebra, geometry, surveying, philosophy books. He went on to become a teacher and eventually the Kansas City School District's first superintendent, where he served until he died at his desk, which was known as his post of duty, in August of 1914. His passing had followed a career of some 4 decades as superintendent. Bringing the library to the community and keeping pace with Kansas City's rapid growth fell to another early leader, Carrie Westlake Whitney. She spent her adolescence in Sedalia, Missouri, and attended boarding school in St. Louis. She married Dr. Edward W. Judson in 1875, but they separated within a few years. Whitney was living in Kansas City by 1880. She became head librarian the following year, when she was around 27 years old. And this is the point where I always like to point out that when she came to Kansas City, I was looking at census records and everything, and she subtracted a few years from her age. At the library, Whitney supervised a collection of 2,000 books and a small reading room. 4 years later, she married James Steele Whitney, who was probably a dozen years younger than her and was a reporter for the Kansas City Star. However, James's health failed a little over a year into their marriage, and he moved to the drier climate of Colorado to live with Carrie's siblings. He died in 1890 after they had been married for 5 years, and the library closed for one day to honor his passing. The twice-wed Carrie retained the Whitney name and never married again. From then on, the Kansas City Public Library came first. This foundational era was a period of unparalleled growth, in many ways marked by the involvement of women, including librarians like Whitney, and women's civic organizations and social groups. One of these, the Ladies Centennial Association, a group connected to the legacy of the American Revolution, donated $490 in 1874, and that would be equivalent to more than $13,000 today. Those funds were used to help purchase that first set of the American Encyclopedia. In a career of 31 years, Whitney pursued and delivered an expansionist vision for library services to the community. Her efforts culminated in the city's first purpose-built public library facility at 8th and Oak Streets in 1889. The two-story brick building cost $10,000 with 15,000 books on the first floor. School district offices occupied the second floor. Featured electric chandeliers for artificial illumination. And although it was a significant step forward from the adapted spaces that they used before this, the growth of the city quickly eclipsed what this facility could offer. It was followed by, in 1897, by a larger building at 9th and Locust Streets. It's a second Renaissance Revival-style building, and it was built at a cost of $200,000. With several remodeling projects and an expansion in 1917 to 1918, which doubled its size to more than 60,000 square feet, it would serve as the main public library all the way until 1960. In fact, the building is still there, and it's owned by the Ozark National Life Insurance Company. People of Kansas City finally possessed a free and open community space with fully equipped reading areas, browsing stacks, a newspaper reading room. Whitney's views on education and children directly influenced the students of the school district and any child who utilized the library services. She was skeptical of popular fiction, which she described as, in her words, the national taste for reading trashy literature. She favored classical literature and nonfiction reading, whereas in her words, this sensational literature is addressed to the feelings, and this is chiefly the reason why it perverts the taste and darkens the judgment. And the children's room pictured here is the one in the Locust Street building that was considered to be one of the first of its kind in the entire nation. It had at least some of the chairs and tables were a little bit smaller, child size, and for a public library to focus on children as patrons was still quite unusual at the turn of the 20th century. The building also housed the Western Gallery of Art. It was one of two museums that were operated in the building. The Western Gallery quickly became known as the Nelson Gallery of Art for its chief benefactor, William Rockhill Nelson. And as you might suspect, in 1933, its holdings were transferred to the new Nelson Atkins Museum. The Science and Anthropology Museum was in the lower levels of the building, and it displayed portions of the Dyer Indian collection as well as fossil and taxidermy collections. 40,000 items from those collections were later transferred to the new Kansas City Museum in 1940. Additionally, the library added its first branch in Westport in July of 1899. It had its own reference department, children's room, and newspaper reading room. And of course, today, Westport remains the oldest branch still in operation. James Greenwood had once referred to the library's growth as what he called manifest destiny. Indeed, during this first quarter of the library's history, it grew from one bookcase into a center of culture and civic engagement. Whitney's leadership had transformed the library into one of the most distinctive public libraries in the country. Future development, however, did have to take place under different leadership. Reflecting the times, one of the school board members stated that as the library grew, in his words, a man should be selected. And over the course of a year, the board demoted. Whitney resisted this, and eventually they did dismiss her from the position in 1912. Once established, the library needed to consider how it would continue to grow, even while addressing critical questions about its values and services. At the same time, it needed to navigate the challenges of national and international history. On the one hand, this translated into support for America's efforts during the First and Second World Wars. On the other hand, it meant reckoning with waves of censorship that swept the nation during the Red Scare and during the Great Depression. During World War I, the Library Council designated the Kansas City Public Library as one of 12 collection centers to lead a nationwide donation campaign. The ALA set ambitious goals. For Kansas City to raise more than $1 million for the war effort and collect hundreds of thousands of books for military libraries at training centers and on bases, naval vessels, and even international outposts. So that's the library at Camp Funston near Fort Riley today. Would have had some of the books from this effort. The library's war service money drive generated more than $4,000 in 1 week in September of 1917. The library also served as a sales location for the first round of Liberty Bonds, which raised more than $30,000. By supporting the war effort through books and the free exchange of information, the library demonstrated its patriotism and its commitment to freedom. In doing so, however, it largely sidestepped controversies over the government's wartime propaganda and censorship. Censorship at the library finally emerged as an issue of public concern in the midst of the Great Depression. In times of despair, the library provided a lifeline of information, networking, and a place of refuge for the downtrodden. At the same time, in 1930s Germany, the Nazi Party launched a campaign to burn undesirable books. Reacting with alarm, the editors of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in Missouri contrasted the book burning in Germany with the fruits of citizenship in a modern democracy. The editorial stated, "When he wants to read a book, no matter what it is about, or who wrote or published it, A citizen in a democracy goes to his favorite library and borrows it. It's one thing, of course, to oppose book banning in the abstract. It's another to wrangle with real-world moral quandaries in a community context in a certain point in time with many differing viewpoints. In Kansas City, the debate coalesced around John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. The fictionalized account of the plight of migrant farmers during the Depression harshly depicted living standards, labor conflicts, and violence. To some critics, its realism and its metaphors were unfit to be read, especially by children and teens. It's important to remember that the library was still a part of the school district at this time. So when the Board of Education was making decisions, and the general public also weighed in at board meetings and in newspapers and other forums. For example, Clarence Decker, the president of the University of Kansas City, offered an opinion in favor of freedom of reading, saying, "Certainly Steinbeck's moving portrayal of certain aspects of American life should shame us into making ours a more livable country." And of course, the book details many other viewpoints. Ultimately, the school board banned The Grapes of Wrath from circulation for nearly a year, starting in 1939. After the book won the Pulitzer Prize in the May of 1940, however, the board reconsidered. And they voted again, 4-2, to reinstate the book. It did remain on a restricted list, which would have made it harder for children and teens to access it. Before these debates over book banning could be fully settled in Kansas City, the United States' entry into another world war loomed. As in the First World War, the library answered the call to duty by fundraising and sending materials to the conflict, this time through the Victory Book Campaign. Chairman of the campaign, O.A. Greer, who is pictured at front right, led the Kansas City effort to collect hundreds of thousands of books. "Books will help us win this war," explained novelist and Kansas City Star reporter Kenneth S. Davis. He added, "They maintain morale and broaden the mental horizons of the individual soldier. And books are real ammunition in our fight against the regimented anti-culture of the Axis hordes." Most notably, many people who worked for the library joined the armed forces to support the war effort directly. The library's chief of stacks, John Rankin Greenlee, maintained an honor roll of veterans in a ledger that is still held in the Missouri Valley Special Collections today. More than 170 names were listed, including women who served in the Women's Army Air Corps and the Red Cross, and men in every branch of service. By the end of the war, 7 former employees of the library had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. After libraries supported the effort to defeat fascism, it made little sense to them that public institutions would limit patron access to unpopular books and ideas. This view was underscored during the Cold War when the Soviet Union implemented book bans and other censorship to control dangerous ideas. In Kansas City, the library eventually began participating in Banned Books Week, and of course today it upholds the ALA's Freedom to Read statement and the Library Bill of Rights. Book banning and censorship were not the only contentious issues that faced the library in the mid-20th century. The most pressing issue was related to racial segregation, which of course was deeply ingrained in the United States, in Missouri, and in Kansas City. In this context, the library's record of service to the community did not extend equally to all members of the community for much of the 20th century. With the public library being a part of the school district, its expansion from the 1910s into the mid-20th century placed most of its new public library branches inside school buildings. This arrangement promised greater efficiency, but it also reflected the biases of the time. Officially, the library branches were not racially segregated by policy. However, being inside of schools that were racially segregated until Brown v. Board obviously had implications for who could access these branches. After Brown v. Board, of course, de facto racial segregation persisted and still persists in many aspects of Kansas City life, with Troost Avenue being the best known dividing line. Hiring practices were another issue specific to the library. Prior to the civil rights movement, library administrators consistently referred to there being black and white branches, despite the non-segregation policy that was supposedly in place. And black professional librarians were not hired to work in any of the so-called white branches or in the main library for some years. From 1922 to 1969, the Lincoln branch, located in Lincoln High School at 19th and Tracy Avenue, was the most prominent branch serving the black community. On the one hand, it was the only branch specifically serving the black community anywhere in Missouri, or at least it was believed to be, and it was considered an excellent facility for at least the first half of its existence. On the other hand, as early as 1930, Library Journal, the primary trade outlet for the field, questioned why there had been no black librarians placed in charge of the Lincoln branch. In 1940, the Negro Chamber of Commerce took the next step and protested outside the main library until the library agreed to place Mildred Kimbrough in charge of the branch. And Mildred Kimbrough she later married and became Mildred Robinson, and she is in the center behind the desk. By 1967, the Lincoln branch had closed to the public to refocus as a student media center. And in 1968, the Paseo branch also closed to the public. Now, there had once been a plan to replace these two branches, but it was not carried out. That left two of the most populous black neighborhoods without nearby library services. So to explain the background, in 1956, a bond issue had been approved by voters by a 4-to-1 margin. The district's proposal at that time included funding for 3 new buildings: the main library, which opened at 12th and McGee Streets, 1960, the Plaza branch, which opened in 1967, and a new branch that would have been at Linwood Boulevard and Tracy Avenue. The Linwood and Tracy branch was never constructed, and the bond funds were exhausted before it could be built. In the summer of 1968, Kansas City also hosted the ALA's annual conference. Among other things, this conference placed a spotlight on the local libraries. Just before the conference, a Library Journal article aired the allegations made by a former staff member, including service gaps to impoverished areas and neighborhoods with racial minorities. A second Library Journal article came out and was titled "The Hole in the Donut," and authored by Thorpe Menn, the book review editor for the Kansas City Star. Yet another article was titled "The School Board That Played Public Library." By this point, Kansas City was one of the only remaining cities in the country with the library still a part of the school district. The author of "The Hole in the Donut" argued that This contributed to the library offering unequal services and being surrounded by library systems that were delivering more equitable services to their communities. Hence the hole or coverage gap in the middle of the donut. And so where we are today is in the triangle that is in the polka dot, kind of here. And there is a North Kansas City Public Library system. Whoa. That reactivated. There's a Mid-Continent Public Library that basically circles Johnson County Library in Kansas and the Kansas City, Kansas Public Library on the Kansas side, with other libraries further afield. In the same summer that the Paseo branch closed, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and protests in Kansas City resulted in the deaths of 6 black residents during encounters with police. The Mayor's Commission on Civil Disorder identified the failed racial integration of schools as one of the leading factors of civic discord, and deficiencies in the library's services echoed many of the problems in the schools. What followed this was a near 20-year period where school district and library leaders were indeed trying to fill service gaps at the library. Various grants were sought out, leadership changed multiple times, more equitable hiring practices were gradually adopted, temporary branches were opened in strip malls and community centers, and partnerships began with organizations like the Black Archives of Mid-America. But the economy and the politics of the 1970s and 80s made it impossible for the library to expand or even maintain its existing services. In fact, the number of staff declined by around 40% between 1971 and 1982. 40% in 11 years. Bond issues and levy campaigns for the library or library and schools were repeatedly failing with voters. And the pattern that we saw as researchers was that library values were starting to evolve to become more inclusive, but the library's capacity to do anything about it was slowly dying. The situation did eventually improve. Daniel J. Bradbury became library director in 1983. And we had the opportunity to interview Dan Bradbury for the book. And he recalled that his first order of business was to reassess and replace most of the library's branches, this time outside of school buildings, and to ensure equitable service to the entire population of Kansas City, regardless of background. During the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, all of the branches, except for Westport, were indeed replaced. Also in that time, in 1988, the library finally separated from the school district and established its own board and taxing district. The first of the new branches at 3050 Prospect Avenue served an area that had not had full library service for nearly 20 years by this point. That is the Lucille H. Bluford branch. The one-time student of Lincoln High School, Bluford went on to become reporter, editor, and part owner of the Kansas City Call newspaper. In 1938, she applied to the University of Missouri's graduate journalism program. Her application was provisionally accepted, but when she attempted to enroll in person, the school denied her entry because of her race. With backing from the NAACP, she filed suit in 1940. Lucille Bluford versus S.W. Canada which was named for the university registrar who blocked her entrance, reached the Missouri Supreme Court. Its judges upheld the university's denial, but ruled that Lincoln University and HBCU had to establish a master's program by February of 1941. Bluford continued to press for civil rights throughout her life, including the Public Accommodation Ordinance of 1964, which outlawed segregation in public spaces in Kansas City. And of course, today there is a Lucille Bluford Day in Missouri. Bluford herself had penned an editorial in the Call in favor of the ballot measure that provided funding for the library's new branch, not knowing that it would be named after her initially. At the groundbreaking ceremony on September 1st, 1987, she donned a hard hat and dug the first shovel of dirt. At the same time, she remarked to the press that black residents were once not even allowed in Kansas City's public libraries. The statement was not 100% accurate, but she elaborated on opening day, and I quote, "This place was promised to this area a long time ago, and we're just now getting it." Indeed, she had waited for more than 30 years since the original passage of bond funds for a full-service branch on the east side. On opening day, July 30th, 1988, Bluford was the first patron to enter the branch and the first to borrow a book. Another remarkable story, also tied to a branch library, is that of Irene Ruiz. Ruiz practiced service to the community throughout her 20-year career as a Kansas City librarian, beginning in 1976. From there, she almost single-handedly transformed library services to the Hispanic community. She served as the West Branch librarian, following the branch each time that it relocated, from West Junior High School initially to a retail area at 902 Southwest Boulevard in 1988, and then to 525 Southwest Boulevard in 1995. During her time in the branch, she collected Spanish-language books, reference materials, and films to address the dearth of materials of interest to the West Side community. She said, "Books open up a new world to you." There was no historical account of Kansas City's Hispanic communities. So between 1977 and 1982, she conducted oral history interviews, many in Spanish, of over 60 people. These focused on the lives and the family stories of community members dating back to the 1920s and 30s. When Ruiz retired in October of 1996, she did so humbly, and she rejected any celebration or even any public acknowledgement that she had retired. People noticed her absence, though, and there was a petition that called on her to unretire. Sadly, she did not. But she did continue volunteering for Children's Story Hour for more than a decade. In 2000, the library's Board of Trustees set up a citizens committee to select names for a new West Side branch. It would be at 2017 West Penway Street. The committee made 3 recommendations, and the board selected Biblioteca de las Americas, or Library of the Americas in English. But in June and July of that year, a grassroots campaign demanded that the library should name the location after Irene Ruiz. The board eventually agreed, and they altered the name to Irene H. Ruiz Biblioteca de las Americas, or the beloved Ruiz branch. The branch opened on September 10th, 2001, and then 5 days later, as the nation was mourning the tragedy of 9/11, the library went forward with celebrations of the new facility. Director Dan Bradbury explained at the time that part of terrorism is to terrorize and disrupt, and we just didn't want to allow it to ruin all of this. Irene Ruiz passed away on September 3rd of last year at the age of 102. Going back to the early 70s for a minute, and a young civil rights activist and executive director of the Kansas City branch of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, Emmanuel Cleaver II. Emmanuel Cleaver advocated for the library to better serve the Black community at that time, in the early 70s. He wrote to the library director, Stephen Kirk, with concern, this is, I quote, with concern over the lack of adequate library facilities in the Black community. He wanted to know the plans and goals of the library system as they specifically relate to the Black community. He further explained in this letter that the Promise branch on the east side had not yet been built. The SCLC went on to oppose a school and libraries bond measure that was then under consideration because it did not allocate funding for this branch in the Black community. And my co-author and I were also fortunate we were able to interview now Congressman Emmanuel Cleaver II. And he recalled to us that when he first came to Kansas City in the early 70s, and I quote, "It was in the library where my consciousness was awakened. The thing that drove me crazy was that this center of enlightenment was not available to all people." He reflected, however, on how far the library has come since the 1980s, with the Bluford branch, refugee and immigrant services, more equitable branch services, and so many more programs. And now Cleaver told us the library has become what I always wanted it to be. It can never be said that the work of desegregation is finished or that the values of inclusivity and diversity are fully realized. But Cleaver's journey from concerns about library equity to becoming one of its most vocal supporters is a sign that the library's community services were finally reaching the full community. One other aspect, kind of lighten the mood. One other aspect of the library's history that has enabled it to empower the community, even as new generations come and go and don't always understand one another, the relentless advancement of technology and changes in culture necessitate new innovations at each turn. The library has proved eager to embrace changing circumstances and introduce its own innovations. In the earlier years, this meant that the library needed to consider how it might utilize sound recordings, motion pictures, radio. At the turn of the 20th century, piano player rolls were all the rage and part of the collection. An in-house bindery allowed for efficient repair of thousands of books per year, returning them back to circulation. You could renew books by phone fairly early in the 20th century. By the end of the 1930s, library staff were hosting their own radio show, which won the ALA's prestigious John Cotton Dana Award for Excellence in Public Relations, an award that is still sought after today. By 1944, a staggering 46% of the city's population held a library card. That was the highest among large cities across the nation. And patrons were checking out some 2 million books, figured that basically doubled to 4 million books by the 1960s. In 1950, after years of planning, the system purchased what it called a branch library on wheels, or simply bookmobile. to deliver materials to homes, schools, other locations. The bookmobile circulated 100,000 books in its first year, which was 3 times greater than the average branch. The main library, constructed in 1960, promised an innovative solution to an unpredictable future. Most interior walls were reconfigurable, so that departments and collections could be expanded or contracted with the changing times. Its parking lots better accommodated America's favorite form of transportation, the automobile. It also debuted the Missouri Valley Special Collections, providing access to archival source materials for the region. This building eventually grew obsolete after the library and school district parted ways, so after 1988, with each organization eventually seeking out their own separate headquarters. The original Plaza branch featured a wall of glass on its north side, which permitted natural illumination for a hanging garden that extended from ground level to the ceiling. Architects touted humidity control that they believed would benefit plants and books alike. I was skeptical too. The garden also, it was meant to complement the reading tastes of many of the branch's patrons in the plaza. There was a 15-foot transparent water column and 3 water domes that completed the effect. This facility served the community for the remainder of the 20th century, but it eventually became impossible to repair due to the geology of the earth beneath it. As the computer age dawned, the library digitized its card catalogs, opened computer labs, subscribed to internet databases, developed its own websites. Beyond technology, innovation can also be seen in how services are organized and new policies developed. So outreach services brought the library outside of its walls and met patrons on their own terms. Late fees were eliminated with the new Freedom from Fines policy in 2019. Signature events have brought tens of thousands of people into the library to hear directly from renowned authors and public figures. And the book provides much more detail about innovation of recent years and their community impact, alongside the many people who have made the library's success possible. Tellingly, in 2008, the library received the National Medal for Museum and Library Service from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It is considered the highest honor a public library can receive for service to the community. Fittingly, it was Representative Emanuel Cleaver who originally nominated the library for that honor. By any measure, the library has successfully integrated into the community's social fabric and become one of its most indispensable institutions. With such an extraordinary record and the support of its patrons, the Kansas City Library is prepared to make the next 150 years as distinguished as the first. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, and we'll take questions from all of you sitting here. If anyone has a question, please go up to the microphone so that people at home can hear you as well as people here. And anyone who's watching at home, you can put your questions in the chat, and I will read them to the audience here.
I enjoyed the talk, and I have 2 comments. In the 9th and Locust building, there was an African American sitting in that library, and I was wondering how he got away with it. And then the other question is, you haven't said anything about the Kempers and what they did for the library, and it's led to a lot of national recognition for us. So
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Well, first question first. the main library in that time was, in contrast to the branches, the main library was indeed open to people of all races. So there are photos like that, and that's one reason that I really was excited about that photo. So I'm glad that you have pointed that out for everyone. And the second question, you probably noticed that I have not provided much detail tonight about like the last 30 or so years, and part of that is just that it's awkward talking about all the people that I've been working with and everything. So many people have contributed to this book, though. We've had 2 people in this room have helped edit it, and definitely the Kempers are in the book.
Yeah, I just want to congratulate you. You're a fine historian. I appreciate it. But history continues to be a part of the present day, and there is controversy with, censorship from Jeff City, to be blunt about it, about how we ought to be doing our business. I'm just curious, as somebody who knows the history of the library, how do you see the library negotiating with certain other authorities about, maintaining your integrity or your willingness to be, open-minded and everything like that? How do you see your role, or maybe the library's role, in negotiating with pretty powerful people who think, the library needs to straighten up and fly right, or however you want to put it? How do you see yourself or the library as a whole engaging in those discussions that are probably going forward as we speak? I appreciate that.
It's a hard question, but the library is signed on to the ALA Bill of Rights, and there is so much work going on to support the freedom to read, and I think that really the answer boils down to advocacy. Just continue pressing these rights and freedoms to access to information and to books. And that is what we can do. And I believe that there has been significant success in maintaining intellectual freedom in recent years, despite some of these issues coming up. Thank you.
I would like to make 2 comments. I would like to have been a fly on the wall when the system, the board, changed their opinion because of the Pulitzer Prize. I would like to have listened to the comments and how they backed up. It would have been interesting. Yeah. Number 2, in 1966, I was in the Army basic training, and the only place that I could get to at Fort Benning, Georgia, that was air-conditioned was the library. And I spent an awful lot of time in the Fort Benning, Georgia library, because I could read and I could listen to music, and I was air-conditioned. Thank you.
Thank you.
I grew up in Kansas City in the Westport area, and the Westport Branch Library was my home library for many, many years. Today I live downtown, and I'm almost a daily user of the Central Library here, primarily in the computer labs. I wonder if you could say anything about the way the Central Library has evolved into a comprehensive social service provider, and also serves as a day room for many of the homeless people who spend their nights at the various shelters in the city.
That's a great question. The social services at the library would, that's a topic, I guess, that came up. We definitely saw it as early during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. and that was, it was just hundreds of people, thousands of people coming to the library. They're down on their luck and just seeking assistance or a warm place, to be. And that has come up, and it is in the book, as a service that the library is providing to the community throughout many decades. And so I'm not sure, well, it has evolved, I guess, in the last 20 years, because there are a much more systematic intervention or assistance that is occurring here at the library. So things along the lines of social workers or people with background in social work being hired, and more, I guess, intentional connections for people who come to the library and need a place to sleep. They need to help finding a job and things of that nature. So that may be kind of a vague response, but it is the best that I can do, is to say that it has been an issue and I guess a point of pride to provide that service for many decades.
In answer to the patron who wanted to be a fly on the wall during the board meeting, as Jason said, 2 of the editors of the book are here tonight. I'm one of them, and retired staff writer Steve Weberg is the other one. And he just pointed out that there's an excellent play-by-play that Jason included in the book of that board meeting about the grapes of wrath. So what we'll do next, if everyone is done asking questions, is we'll hand out books to all of you. And if you'd like Jason to sign it, please go over by the purple table and he'll sign it there. If not, you can take one over by the elevators. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jason, for this.
Thank you.